So this is Law, History and Context, podcast number 2. We'll mostly be asking the question today, what's next for lawyers and social movements? We'll be discussing the evolution of social movements and the evolution of the roles that lawyers played in these social movements with reference to some of the issues that arise. So I'm Laura, and I'm going to be talking about the problem of lawyers as an elite group and the effect that has on the success of a social movement.
Hi, I'm Tom. I'll be talking about positive and negative ramifications of social groups and the potential future of those social groups.
Hi, Veronica, and I will be focusing on the issue of how lawyer and client relationship make lawyers ineffective, potentially ineffective social agent in social movement. So I think the first one is like how lawyer-client relationship actually make lawyers or put lawyers in position of ineffective social advancement agent, because we know that in lawyering the main issue is the lawyer-client relationship, where the lawyer is accountable to act in the best interest of the client. So in such situation, the lawyer will have to act and find all the possible solution for the client, and if necessary, the lawyer might need to ignore other third-party interests, include the public interest. And this can be one of the example is the American Lazen case, which highlight the tension between confidentiality and public interest. In that case, a lawyer represents a client who was charged with murder, and the client actually disclosed to his lawyer that he had committed another unsolved murder, and that was confirmed by the lawyer visiting the site where a body was located. And that case went to court, and the judge in that case decided that the lawyer had did the right thing as under the lawyer-client relationship, because the lawyer was accountable to preserve the confidentiality between him and client, despite of the fact that in that case the parents of the victim actually had announced publicly that they are searching for their children, who in fact had been killed by the client in that case.
Yeah, so as part of the lawyer's usual work, it's not very conducive to social causes.
Yes, because in tackling social issue, we need to be mindful of all the other interests as well. But in lawyer and client relationship, you have to be client-centered interest. But regardless of that, as a lawyer, we need to be mindful that we have our primary duty to the court, duty to the court, and not to mislead them. And as the officer of court, lawyers need to be mindful of their primary duty to the administration of justice.
You think that kind of clashes with the facilitation of social movements? Yeah.
I think in some way, yes.
So a relevant question to ask here is whether the characteristics of the leaders of a social movement affect its success. I think there's clearly problems when a group of elites affect widespread social change, when it's not coming from grassroots activists, in that it doesn't really fit well with giving power to the people, which is, sort of an underlying concept of social movements. For example, the NAACP in the US was initially led by predominantly older, white, upper-class individuals, which were, the elite group of the time. Even advocates like Martin Luther King and Gandhi can also be considered elites. So King was a highly educated political representative and leader. He wasn't your average African-American. And Gandhi was a lawyer who had access to higher education overseas. Again, not your average downtrodden Indian under British rule.
Could you say that they, even though they were elites by that standard that they were kind of harnessing that kind of will of the people sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. But I just think it's relevant to look at the types of people that lead social change and whether that has implications for its legitimacy.
Okay.
I think there should be a lag between cultural change and legal and court decisions, because if the courts and the law moves too far ahead of public opinion, there can be a bit of a backlash that could end up undermining the movement that the action is supposed to advance. And this being the case, I don't think that lawyers are necessarily the ideal leaders of social movements and potentially could play a more helpful role in supporting non-legal advocates to make their case.
Do you think it varies between certain social movements? They're not always at the head of the movement?
As in, lawyers aren't always at the head of the movement.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, and it certainly would depend on the nature of the cause. But just in a general kind of sense, I suppose, as well as a lot of negative perceptions about lawyers in the general community, and it may not be exceptionally helpful to your cause to have a member of that group leading the charge, especially if it's a hot topic or a very contentious issue that's dividing society. So how do lawyers assist non-legal advocates? Generally speaking, to gain support for a cause, leaders of any type need to foster a sense of compelling public purpose and a social and legal environment that renders certain behaviours as more or less desirable, depending on what your cause is. And because social movements affect people from all parts of society, lawyers working for a cause will frequently be part of a larger team that includes non-lawyers. So a key aspect of working in that kind of combined team is to empower all of the members of the team and also members of the community at large to be able to use the legal system to advocate for themselves. Because I think that's one of the biggest factors that makes lawyers an elite group separate from the rest of society, is that many members of the community aren't equipped to effectively use the legal system to help them and help their cause.
Do you think that that's just like a kind of side effect of the whole separation of powers, so that you need those certain groups who have a certain understanding of certain things? Or do you think it's a deliberate sort of separation to deliberately distance the public from access? Or?
I don't think it's necessarily deliberate. I think it's just the way that our society's developed, as because you said, we've got the separation of powers. But it can have unfortunate consequences, particularly when you've got someone from a socially or educationally disadvantaged or impoverished background who doesn't have access to the resources they could be using to help their cause. So I've got an example, which is the California Tobacco Control Program. So that was a social movement in the late 90s. And they had a very successful program downgrading the use of tobacco and cigarettes and smoking. But the lawyers working for the program, instead of directly litigating on behalf of the anti-tobacco movement, they provided legal support and education and access to legal resources to relevant members of the community, to health organisations, to government departments, just to interested activists. Yeah, rather than getting up in court and arguing the case. And it's hard to say whether social movements that have involved litigation would have been more successful if there hadn't been legal input in that way. But it's clear that legal support, rather than the lawyers at the tip of the arrowhead, also is effective.
And do you think they deliberately didn't become involved because they were kind of worried of a backlash, or?
It's possible. The article that I read on this didn't specifically talk about the motivations of the relevant lawyers, but yeah, I think that especially tobacco control is quite a contentious issue.
Yeah.
It's a big part of a lot of people's lives, and I think that absolutely, lots of big corporations are invested in it, and I don't think that a hardcore legal regime to flat out ban smoking or something like that I don't think that would have the same effect as a long-term community education program.
Yeah, I agree.
So the case study that I looked at in my essay was LGBTQI rights and the case of Toonen and Kroon. So, Toonen in Australia, Mr. Toonen was a Tasmanian gay rights activist who went to the UN Human Rights Committee to challenge the anti-homosexual provisions that used to be in the Tasmanian Criminal Code on the basis that they contravened his right to privacy under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Australia is a signatory. So the context of the situation was that the usual channels for law reform had failed in Tasmania to decriminalise homosexuality because the Legislative Council was repeatedly blocking any action, whether legal or otherwise, including recommendations from the Tasmanian Law Reform Commission. So we had two concerned citizens who were directly affected by this legislation, Mr. Toon and Mr. Kroom, and they felt that drastic action at a high level was needed. They contacted Justice Michael Kirby to ask for his advice. This is another eminent gay rights activist, and he essentially told them not to bother and that the international courts would not be taking up the issue. Their efforts would be better spent at a local level. They essentially ignored him and took the matter to the UNHRC, which upheld the complaint, which is fantastic, obviously, which sparked federal reform at the Commonwealth level, which in turn led to a High Court case because the Tasmanian government did not make any changes at that time. The High Court case was Kroom in Tasmania. It's a question of the inconsistency between the Federal Act and the Tasmanian Criminal Code. There was a secondary issue about whether Mr. Kroom had standing to bring the case because he hadn't been adversely affected by the provisions, he hadn't been arrested or treated differently. But just the fact that the provisions existed meant that the DPP could at any time choose to prosecute people like Mr. Kroom and Mr. Toonen, particularly because immediately before their case they just turned themselves into the police as homosexuals. So the court held that their personal lives were in significant respects overshadowed by the offending provisions, and they had standing to bring the matter to court. The constitutional validity of the Federal Act was upheld, and the ultimate outcome was the Legislative Council finally backed down on blocking the reforms because, this is the quote, "we can't discriminate anymore." I think that this shows that thanks to the work of Mr. Toon and Mr. Kroom, who were not legal advocates, who were not lawyers themselves, with the assistance of their legal teams, that helped them taking their campaigns to the highest levels, a social and legal environment emerged that rendered anti-homosexual behaviour undesirable and unacceptable. And we can continue to see those ongoing social changes today. For example, Rodney Kroom was the Tasmanian Australian of the Year in 2015, which probably would have been not something anyone would have imagined back in the late 90s when these cases were coming through. I think it's significant that it was the grassroots activists to whom the campaign had personal meaning and impact, who were the figureheads, the leaders of the movement, rather than the lawyers working to take their cases as far as we could. Obviously, the campaign could not have progressed without the assistance provided by the legal team, so I think it's really important that lawyers empower advocates to take their cases themselves.
So do you think if the plaintiff in this case are lawyers, would that make the result or the campaign led stronger?
I don't think necessarily if they happen to have been lawyers it would have made their case weaker. I just think that it's a good example of people who are personally, if they were homosexuals who also happened to be lawyers, I think the fact that they were lawyers would be not as relevant. It's the fact that it was personal, it had a personal impact on them.
So it's more like connection, personal experience.
Yeah, it gets over the problem of an elite group making a decision, even though ultimately it was the courts that made this decision.
Yeah.
It wasn't taken to them by a group of elites.
Okay, so my essay, and generally more to the point, towards the overall theme, covering the effectiveness of lawyers in social movements, but recognising both the positive and negative aspects. So the positive aspects, like you touched on before, the NAACP, NAACP, Mabo. So he obviously facilitated much of it, but he was helped a lot by Townsville University, I think off the top of my head. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry, but just off the top of my head. And Yeah, and also the current marriage equality. What would you call it? Postal vote?
The postal vote, yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to think. It's not technically a referendum, is it?
No.
Unfortunately. Yeah. So I think it's the Australian Law Society. They've backed the Yes campaign. The Prime Minister's backed the Yes campaign. And then, as we all know, there's other people who backed the No campaign. Good old Tony Abbott.
Our favourite person.
Making friends down Salamanca. But yeah, so that's the positive side of things. And it's pretty good to see that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But then you've also got to look at the more negative side of things. So the rise of kind of anarchists, what would you call them, anarcho-communists? Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe them. So Antifa, the by any means necessary kind of groups. Who else? Can't really think of any other ones off the top of my head. But yeah, so those kind of groups, they're deliberately abusing the social movement process to then undermine liberal democracy. That's one of their long-term goals. And they'll exploit freedom of speech laws and freedom of assembly to then shut down other groups who are exercising their right to free speech and then resort to physical political violence. And that, unfortunately, is becoming sort of a common factor. But yeah, so I made note of how lawyers are ideally placed within society to then facilitate social movements because they've got a higher than normal understanding of legal procedures and how the government works and how they can then facilitate groups and kind of gather everyone together and then give them a sort of a solid agenda. And like I said, you don't need lawyers for that, but in certain circumstances, they're actually ideally placed to get that going. And there is some debate, especially when I was looking into the NAACP, I'll get that right, that some people said that the lawyers are actually taking sort of a backseat role and they've reanalysed it with more historical factors and more relevant evidence. But yeah, so I touched again on the Brown and Board of Education. So I had that. I touched on the Mabo case, showing that kind of positive side, but then also critiquing the effectiveness overall. So I just wanted to add a counterpoint there to be well, I think they're effective. Certain academics kind of think that that's not really the case all the time, and that they're more, like you said earlier, they're better in that support role than leading the time movement for a number of reasons. So generally people want to feel like it's a grassroots, it's come from the ground up, and all the time, the lawyers being seen as elitist, it's not the best look.
No.
Yeah. But yeah, then I went on to kind of highlighting the negative side of things. So, and Antifa is nothing new. It's been around since, I think, the 20s. Yeah, so it's a kind of a radical far-left movement that fought with the Nazis, ironically. So they're pretty much true to their word on that one. But it almost seems like a tainting of what was the initial goal and kind of a blurring because they enjoy a pretty strong media bias. And while they highlight their positive points, which they do have some positive points, because there's no just one person is bad. They never give the full picture, and that doesn't really do the public justice.
Do you think that the blurring of a message is, or of a name, is sort of inevitable when it comes to long-term social movement groups?
I think it is to an extent, but there almost seems like a sort of concerted effort and since there's massive media monopolies, so I think all of the media corporations in America are owned by 7 groups, I think.
Yep.
7 people overall. Might fact check that one, but yeah, so there's, once they get a sort of an agenda, they push it pretty strongly. But yeah, so tying into that is the propensity of lawyers to push social movements, but it's generally only effective in liberal democracies. So where you're allowed to have free speech, you're allowed to assemble in open, you're allowed to have your own opinion that's contrary to the government, there isn't just one central government, that sort of thing. And then I went on to highlight how in China, not really much of a surprise, where this is actively suppressed. So, ironically, there was sort of a period from about, off the top of my head, I think it was from around 2000 to about 2010, where it was all right, and they actually did allow some social movements to be facilitated. But then, once these started to gather momentum, and it started to then question the state, like authority power, that's when things started to go south very quickly, and like they were actively repressed. And what would often happen is charges would just be made up. It's pretty commonplace in China, unfortunately. Like you're acting against the state, or you're undermining state authority, and then just disappear for like years. It's not really a good sort of thing. And it kind of shows how, while they would allow some movements, like some rights movements, as long as it wouldn't interfere with the state's authority, once you go anywhere near the state's authority, that's just immediate sort of suppression.
Yeah.
And an interesting kind of example of this was where you get a bit of both is Hong Kong, because obviously Hong Kong changed hands a few decades ago from the British. They have that kind of liberal democratic legal tradition, and there's also a big split between their barristers and their solicitors, which is kind of like a little hangover from the British, because they love doing that. But yeah, so the barristers are more for open sort of human rights, social movements, whereas if the solicitors are kind of slowly turning towards, they still agree with some social movements, but they're more supportive of sort of Beijing's authority in some ways, which is it's kind of interesting to see that kind of disconnect. And it kind of overplays into their own autonomy as well. They feel very protective of that. And a lot of distance from mainland China when it come to Hong Kong to speak their mind, because they're not allowed to do it.
Yeah, right.
In mainland.
Wow.
Yeah. And then I kind of went on to talk about, where are we? Yeah, Turkey. So Turkey's a really good example of where it was an open democratic society, and it's slowly within the last few years just kind of degraded into an authoritarian, totalitarian state. So it was initially, I think, around a few years ago, where, because Turkey's, it's one of those countries where there's just a history of coups, like military coups. And the coup, I think it was 2 years ago, that particular coup just looked very staged, because in the history of all those military coups, they're generally an overwhelming amount of the military's involved. They're very swift. There's not that much death.
Yep.
If any, it's pretty smooth. Whereas if the most recent one, I think it was only like 14 or 15% of the entire defence force was involved.
Yeah, right.
A lot of people just were told that they were doing manoeuvres.
Yep.
Or training, that sort of thing. And then, yeah, it was basically, it looked like it was staged to then do a wide range crackdown on the judiciary, lawyers, the media, academics, pretty much anyone who didn't agree with the main party. And that carried over into the court system. So like social movements in that regard, like for human rights and for Kurdish people as well.
Yep.
In the region, so there'd be certain lawyers facilitating those rights, and then they'd just be actively suppressed, which is pretty sad, but slowly kept happening. And then with the referendum this year, which was widely seen as rigged, so people voting yes would put like multiple ballots in for the yes, and then they would discount that, and it was pretty ugly. But so yeah, the rule of law is effectively gone, and social movements are actively suppressed, which is pretty sad. But if anything, it's a good sort of case study to see how it can happen relatively quickly within a few years.
Yeah, right.
And then just pretty much go south.
Do you think there's absolutely no hope for social movements in those kind of circumstances when there's not, really an authoritarian state?
I think you're going to have very little of any success. You might have some success as long as you don't go anywhere near the state's authority. So if it's a small, medium, sort of small, that sounds a bit silly, like what range is medium, small? But like as long as it's not impeding on the state's power, you're not challenging them, you'll probably have some success. Because then the state will probably want that too, because it'll make them look better. So they're like, oh, we're helping people. Whereas at the moment you go and you're saying, well, the state's wrong, we should have elections. Why is there one state that tells us what to do? Then you pretty much got to go missing at that point, unfortunately.
Mm.
Yeah.